John's already given you an introduction of where I'm coming from personally and organizationally. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to start just by looking at a video, just 4.5 minutes, which is actually a PowerPoint presentation in itself on YouTube, which just tells the story of our experience with COVID over the last year, which I want to draw on. I know all our experiences are different. We're in the same storm, but in different boats, but there are principles that apply. And then I'll give a presentation, then we'll have small group discussion with some questions to ponder on. And then finally, we'll end up with a plenary Q&A and discussion at the end. So that's where we're going. And this is the International Christian Medical and Dental Association that I've been now leading for a couple of years. And before that, I was 27 years with the Christian Medical Fellowship. And the ICMDA brings together over 80 national associations of Christian doctors and dentists throughout the world under one big umbrella. So it's rather like the IFES, but doctors rather than students, if you like. Thanks very much. I hope you're still with us. So that was originally put together as a video for a conference, but it was a good way of describing, in a sense, what we've been through over the last year, and particularly how we adapted or tried to adapt to COVID. And as in any crisis, there were threats, first of all, to mitigate or lessen. And for us, the whole lifeblood of our movement was around conferences and events in various parts of the world, and the support from field workers who would travel all over continents and around the world. And both of those things became immediately impossible with COVID. And as well, we faced the threat of a fall in donation income, because our income, a lot of it was coming through conferences which were no longer being held. And so there were these threats. We had to very quickly pivot, if you like. But there were also opportunities to grasp, as you've seen from the video, online conferences and events. Global webinars were really the big game changer for us in terms of increasing our reach and profile, and then running online training that we used to do in residential contexts. And overall, COVID has been incredibly good for our organization in building it much more strongly, more unified, and more global, so that we're much more closely connected than we were. And we've increased our field staff by about 60% during the year as well. And it was the things that did or did not change. We realized that COVID did not change our vision, our mission, or our aims. Those were all going to be exactly the same, but the way we did things, our modus operandi or strategy, was going to be completely different. And it had good effects for us that we had not anticipated. And so we look back now after a year or so, it didn't always feel like this. And we are really thankful for the blessing of COVID in the way that it's impacted our organization. And we feel that God has really sped us up in some areas and slowed us down in others, but helped to prepare us for the future much more effectively. And it's that this theme of threats and opportunities that I want to come back to in this time that we've got together. So first of all, we're talking about leading through crisis. What is a crisis? And I think there are these four elements: a time of intense difficulty or danger, first of all, posed by a threat, which requires strong leadership, where important decisions need to be made and where actions need to be taken. So the threat, the strong leadership, decisions, and actions. And John F. Kennedy used to quote that the word crisis in Chinese was composed of two characters, one representing danger or threat, and the other one representing opportunity. And what we need to do is to see the silver lining of opportunity behind the dark cloud of threat, and believe that God is in control, leading us through it. And so a crisis is something we welcome rather than being intimidated by it. Now, of course, there are different types of crisis. There are those within the organization that might result, for example, from the sudden death of the CEO, or a moral failure by one of the members of staff, or an IT meltdown, or the loss of a major donor, something like that. And then there are external threats, of course, of which COVID is a classic example, but it could be a global financial crisis, it might be a war, it might be unrest, terrorist activity, or whatever. So if we look at the types of threats that can produce a crisis, they're many and varied. It could be a geopolitical event, pandemic, military coup, terrorist act, natural disaster, accident, a technological disaster, financial meltdown, like the global crisis back in 2008. Or it could be a health-related thing affecting a staff member or several staff members, sudden death, major illness, mental breakdown. Just a few months after I started as the CEO of Christian Medical Fellowship, my last job, our chief administrator came back from the Christmas holiday quite unwell, was diagnosed with cancer and died within a week. So it was a huge unexpected crisis for us to manage through that situation. Infrastructural damage to equipment or to systems. The devil finds a place in computers, doesn't he? And how much damage can be done when IT systems suddenly fail. Financial, a sudden fall of income or a big increase in expenditure from unanticipated damage to infrastructure or buildings or whatever. Behavioral, so it's been a big theme this year or this week, the abuse of power and high profile moral failure among leaders. But it might not be a sexual thing, it could be financial impropriety, a relational breakdown, a Euodia Syntyche type situation within an organization or a church. It could be a legal challenge from outside or reputational damage. When I was working for CMF, we were involved in stopping the change of policy of the British Medical Association on euthanasia, and people were very, very angry about that. And I was on a national news interview with another doctor who was on the opposing side. And on this interview on BBC Radio 4 morning radio with millions of people listening, he said that he was going to launch an investigation of our organization by the Charity Commission for the misuse of funds. Now, we had nothing to fear or be afraid of or hide from, but the very next day a letter arrived and we were in crisis dealing with that in just the proper way. So attacked by the media or on social media, hostile agents or whatever. And then of course there can be spiritual crises from false teaching or from moral compromise within an organization. The crises have a different pattern as well. They might be creeping, foreshadowed by a series of events which people don't recognize. But in retrospect, you look back and say, well, we should have seen that one coming, but we didn't. Or a slow burn where there's some advance warning, but then things get slowly and then rapidly worse. Or it could be a sudden event where the damage has already occurred and will get worse without intervention. Sometimes we think when a crisis comes that things couldn't possibly get worse, but they can get a whole lot worse in some situations. And I think Andy Crouch, his very famous now article, Leading Through the Blizzard, which came out at the beginning of last year, raising the question coming into COVID, is this a blizzard that's going to last a few weeks, or a winter which will last a few months, or a mini ice age that will have effects for years? We need to know about the timescale of the crisis that we're facing, whatever it might be. And then crises are of different types. They might be just affecting primarily one key individual and the people around them. When I started, a couple of years after starting as head of student ministries at CMF, Christian Medical Fellowship in London, my wife's brother, who was also my very best friend, we'd met through him. He was a global pediatrician working for the Centers for Disease Control based in Denmark, and he was drowned on a trip. So sudden death. I was in Ireland, my wife was here when we got the news in the UK. And there was one key individual which created a crisis which was primarily one for our family, but had ongoing effects for others as well. Or it might be affecting a community. Think of the Rohingya people, for example, and their crisis in Myanmar. or it might be a national crisis affecting a whole country. We see the example now of Israel, of course, of Myanmar, what's happened recently in Mozambique, what could happen in Ukraine in the near future, or it could be a global crisis affecting most of the world, like the COVID pandemic has been. Just a few years ago, we were faced in the world by three crises, which were regional, but could very easily have become global. The Ebola crisis, the Ukraine invasion, and the ISIS crisis all happened at the same time, and any one of them at that time could have been a global thing. So global things will often start in one particular place. Now, what is the nature of crisis? Well, I think we need to look at it from a theological, biblical perspective, and where we start is with the absolute sovereignty of God, that God is absolutely in control, not just of every element of the crisis that we're facing, but every element of what happens on planet Earth and throughout the whole of the universe. He is completely sovereign. I form the light and I create darkness. I bring prosperity and I create disaster. Isaiah 45 verses 5-7. And we must not think that the devil is some kind of free agent. He acts only with God's permission. He has to ask God's permission to test Job. He has to ask God's permission to test or serve Peter. The devil is like a dog on a leash. It's God who's absolutely in control of every element. And that's an incredibly encouraging thought to start with. So Amos 3:6, if disaster comes to a city, has not the Lord caused it? Well, he stands behind evil in a different way than he stands behind good, but he's ultimately sovereign over both and will work for good in all situations. Genesis 50:20 was Joseph's words to his brothers that you intended my selling into slavery for evil, but God intended it for good. He had a greater plan beyond it. And of course, the greatest crisis of all in world history, the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, was all part of God's plan to bring salvation. So we must always keep our heads and remember that God is absolutely in control, even if we have no idea what's going to happen next. And that crisis always constitutes these two elements of threat plus opportunity. And we must always look beyond the threat to say, well, if God has allowed this to happen, he must have some plans in it, not just for the whole world, but for me and in my leadership role as well. And therefore, you're looking immediately for the opportunities that are there. You've got to decide on what the threats are to mitigate, the things that need to be controlled in order to prevent human further damage, the new threats that might arise. This is very much at home to me as a surgeon. You get in a tricky situation, you've got to be very calm and controlled and keep your head, because the danger is that you could make a bad situation much, much worse. And we need to mitigate other threats that can arise and not end up going out of the frying pan into the fire. But there'll also be opportunities to grasp and questions to ask. How can we do things in a different way? When for us in ICMDA, I had 3 months of travel planned to about 8 different countries from March to May last year, and all the trips and conferences were immediately cancelled within the space of about a week. And we suddenly had to ask ourselves, well, how do we do things in a completely different way? What do we need to stop doing? We might have already been stopped from doing it. What do we need to start doing? And what is God teaching us through this experience? What way might he be leading us in the future that is different? So crisis management has stages. So there's the pre-crisis, first of all, where there might be warning signs. The question, has God or others actually been warning us that this might happen? In medicine, of course, often a symptom is ignored by the patient. We call it denial, and things get gradually worse, so that when they present, the cancer is inoperable. We could do the same thing with organizations where we're not listening to the warning signs that God is giving us, and then we're going blindly into a situation with a much greater crisis than we would have faced otherwise. Then there's the crisis itself, then there's the cleanup and the rebuilding stage. So let's think the first stage, pre-crisis, and a great idea always to anticipate this. When I was finishing my surgery training and going into the final exam, we were warned, never meet a question for the first time in the final exam that you haven't thought about before. So the idea is that you had to be fully prepared and anticipate what was going to happen. So some kind of simple risk register like this, where you put the item of risk down the left-hand column, and then the risk column is a score of 1 to 5 out of the severity of that event happening. So the likelihood is the chance of it happening from 1 to 5, and then the impact is the multiplication of risk and livelihood. So you get a number from 0 to 25. And then the mitigation is what you plan to do if this thing happens. So if you've thought of this ahead of time and you have a simple risk register like this. So for example, take an extreme example, global thermonuclear war. If that's item number 1, the risk of course is off the scale. The likelihood is probably very, very low. And so the impact is still going to be the product of those things. So it depends on what you put in the left-hand column. Then there's the actual crisis stage itself. And what we do is to focus on the crisis and the threats it poses, and drop everything else that's not important. From my experience as a surgeon, I can remember on 2 occasions when I had to cancel a whole outpatient clinic of 40 people coming along because there was a much more urgent thing that needed my full attention in the hospital. And sometimes you have to make those radical decisions, which involves inconvenience for a lot of people, but there's a more important priority that you have to focus on. And you've got to have the courage and the decisiveness in making those decisions. Consult with key stakeholders, be decisive in making the key decisions, and communicate those decisions and actions very clearly so that people know exactly what is going on. Again, if you're in an emergency room with a critically ill patient, then someone has to take control and give the commentary and instructions for everyone else to handle. And generally in an organization, that's going to be in a church, the pastor, or in an organization, it's going to be the CEO, because that person is in the best position to be doing that. And then there is the cleanup phase, which is repairing the damage that has been done to structure, systems, staff relationships, or whatever. And then the rebuilding stage. What do we do in the future? What are we going to carry on doing? What will we stop doing? And for us, we certainly have found that the organization that's going to emerge after COVID is very, very different from the one that entered it. And we see a lot of this as God's planning. So let's just then think about the stages of leading through crisis. Self-control, assessment, planning, communication, adaptability, relationship management, and creativity. Let's look at each of those. And the first one is all about controlling oneself. They say that crisis reveals character. And to first of all remind ourselves that firstly, God is absolutely sovereign. I have the 3 little scriptures I hold on to. Romans 8:38, 39, nothing can separate us from God's love. John 10:27 to 29, nothing can pluck us out of his hand. And Hebrews 13:5b, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So I hold on to those as my anchor in whatever we're facing, and to believe that he's working for good in all circumstances. So managing our own personal walk with God is incredibly important. If you're in an aircraft and there's an oxygen leak, the first thing you do is put your own oxygen mask on so that you can help others. And you need to attend to your own situation. As Paul says to Timothy, keep your head in all circumstances. Or as in Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength in time of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. So it's getting hold of oneself and making space, especially for the devotional life. Jesus often walked away from situations of ministry because he knew that his own walk with God had to be good. And it's also about our balance of family, work and leisure as well. And I realized quite early on that moving from an itinerant lifestyle to one where I was largely at home, I needed to create a whole different structure. But the backbone of that with my wife was to every morning to spend time in the scriptures and praying together. And then for every evening to go on a walk, usually about 3 or 4 miles for an hour or so, where we would talk through the things of the day. And that created the foundation for the day. I made sure too that I was going for at least 3 runs a week to keep fit. So keeping one's relationships accountable too as well. And then secondly, we've got assessment. So you've, what do I need to know and how can I access it? Bob Beale, my favorite leadership guru, says, once you know all the facts, the answers will jump out at you. So that you need to gather the information and to ask particularly who do I need to advise me and consult with, and to surround yourself with a very small group of trustworthy people, trusted heads. One of the first things I did when COVID started was to bring in my senior team to a weekly meeting, which we then knocked back to fortnightly and is now monthly, so that there were 6 of us sitting around a table making all the decisions together. Don't get isolated in that regard. Then anticipating the impact of the crisis on the organization, the staff and stakeholders, on the community or the nation, and then knowing which elements are within and without one's control, what they call stabilizing the moving parts. Because in a crisis, there will be some things that we just cannot control, but there will be other things that we can have a big influence over. I think the alcoholic's prayer is relevant here. God, give me the courage to change the things I can. Give me the grace to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. So self-control, assessment, and then the third one is planning. So gathering the resources, whether it's information, whether it's people around you, key decision-making groups, whether it's new equipment that you need. For many organizations last year, it was changing to be able to use technology like Zoom and so on, investing in the IT that was going to make it possible. And then finances, of course, as well. What we had to do very early on, because our ministry changed so dramatically, was to call a special board meeting and to tear up the budget for the year and create a new 6-month budget and strategy that everyone could agree to at the top level, because then you have everyone behind you, the board, the staff, you can communicate it very clearly to people. And then reorganize the team. What are the things that only I can do as the leader? I've got to concentrate on those and delegate or leave everything else. What new tasks do I need to take on? What must I give up in order to do that? What can I delegate to others? What are the things I need to stop doing? What new roles might be needed in the organization? If you're dealing with a high profile moral failure in a senior member of your organization, then someone will have to take the lead on the whole process of seeing that through. So this will mean new roles for people and stopping doing other things that they are doing. And there might be decisions to make in terms of impact upon finances, that you can no longer afford to keep the staff on board. Who gets a cut in salaries, a cut in hours? How do you manage that situation? And you set short-term goals. You keep your long-term aims and vision and so on the same, but you're being much more short-term in the way that you plan. And then the next one is communication. So this is extraordinarily important, and thinking of all the stakeholders that you have as a CEO or pastor, you have to keep your board on side and be very clear in communicating to them what is happening, what the expected risks going forward are. And then, of course, your staff, your volunteers, your stakeholders and those who are interested, those you communicate with, and of course, the whole world as well. So the asking of this question, who do I consult and who do I inform at each stage of the process. And then, of course, what's my message in the most simple way, and what's the best medium of sending it out? One of the biggest mistakes that organizations make, and particularly around the area of moral failure, is they go silent and they don't communicate. And then all sorts of misinformation comes in to fill the vacuum, and they lose the narrative and lose control over the direction the organization is going to. You become, if you like, a sitting duck for anyone who wants to bring you down. So it's incredibly important, even when things are uncertain, to communicate very clearly to all your stakeholders about, even if it's just, we are doing an assessment and we will come back to you within this degree of time with a plan and assessment or whatever, so that everyone is clear and people aren't filling the vacuum with damaging rumor. Which brings us on to adaptability. So this is harder for us than others. Some of us thrive on risk. We like the buzz of adrenaline. We like to make last minute decisions. We're quite happy to rip up everything and start again. Others of us are not, because we're just wired differently by God. So we need to know the kind of people we are, and we need to have people on the team with all the different personality gifts who can come to the fore in situations like this. So for us, it meant completely ripping up our whole strategy and budget for the year and starting again, given that we can't do any of these things we'd planned and we haven't got the money we anticipated. What are we going to do that's different? How can we fulfill our vision and a mission in a different way? And for us, it was deciding that actually our vision of a Christian witness through doctors and dentists in every community and every nation had not changed. And our mission to start and strengthen national movements had not changed. And our strategy to train and develop leaders had not changed. But what had changed is that we could no longer do it in the way that we used to do it. Next, number 6, relationship management. What's so important is people, and keeping on side with all the key people, especially those that you are directly responsible for. And this can be very challenging when in fact you're under so much pressure yourself that the temptation is just to become very tunnel visioned and not to think about others' needs. But this is the very moment where you need to be showing empathy, where you need to support people and strengthen their capacity to cope, especially if they're facing change and may find that change very, very difficult. And encouragement, especially from the scriptures, to develop a series of talks where you can come along and remind people of the timeless, eternal truths about God and his faithfulness that will help them to get through these situations. And then the delegation of new tasks and the setting of a very clear direction. And then finally, creativity, grasping the new mission ministry opportunities. And I think for us, again, this last year, we just could not do what we used to do. And so we needed to look for new opportunities. And we really didn't have much of a clue what we could do. So we tried a lot of things. And we found that the things that actually God led us into were not the things we initially thought of. And as I mentioned in the video, the key thing was to start a global webinar series every week. At the same time, every week on the same day, we'd have an expert speaking to Christian doctors and dentists all around the world. And we hadn't anticipated the effect of that it would increase our mailing list by 1,000%, that it would raise the profile of the organization, that it would increase the level of teaching and solidify our identity together. Bob Beale has another saying that last year's greatest unexpected success should be next year's priority. And what's God taught you over the last year through COVID? What is it that you're doing different that you'll say going into the future, we want to keep doing this thing that we would never have thought of doing if it wasn't for COVID? I haven't got a lot of references for you. I think if you want to take a screenshot of this is I think great 10 little things on ways to lead through a crisis, much of which I've covered in different ways here, but connect as a human, stay on top of information, overemphasize on how you're going to prepare for it ahead of time. Don't try and control everything because you can't, but control those things you can. Prioritize well, act responsibly, put people over profit, make yourself available, create space so that you are there for people, because there's a lot of explaining and reassuring to do. Look after yourself. Remember, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then be flexible and be willing to rip everything up if the circumstances call for it. So again, you'll have this if you have my handout, that there are different lots of rich stuff in scripture that can help us in terms of biblical case studies. Nehemiah's rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem. I love David's discovery of the sacking of Ziklag, when he comes back and finds that all his wives and family and all his soldiers, possessions and people have been dragged off by the Amalekites. And or Job's calamities, Moses' management meltdowns, where he found himself as the common pathway for too much and couldn't cope with it and needed to learn to delegate. I think Paul's journey to Rome is a beautiful story on the boat, where there are political and commercial forces directing events that are completely beyond Paul's control. And yet, by just being faithful to God and listening to him and taking the opportunities, he ends up saving a whole shipload of people and being a powerful witness in that situation. We talked about Joseph, and of course the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus, the greatest crisis in world history, or so it seemed, but God was using it to win the salvation of many people.